Dreams Are Nightmares for Traumatized Children by KittyKqt on AO3. Summary: When Izuku gets hit by a dream quirk and transports him, Hitoshi Shinso, and Fumikage Tokoyami into his subconscious, they learn far more than they expected to learn. Trigger warning: gore and one for all vestiges death. Izuku hated his dreams. Long nights of restless sleep, interrupted by nightmares at the worst times. A 3 a.m. wake-up meant he had to be up 3 hours later for school, so there was no point in trying to rest himself back down. He really needed more sleep, but his body truly hated him. He rubbed at his eyes and contemplated just laying in bed on his phone. It was the easiest option, but it wouldn't help him at all. Just a time waster, and no one knew how much time they had anymore. The constant battles with the League were the things that haunted him. He grabbed his newest notebook and pencil combo, put on his slides, and opened the door. If he couldn't sleep, at least he could get some caffeine in his body. "Hey, Izuku," Hitoshi nodded at him, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the counter. "Couldn't sleep again?" Izuku nodded, putting his notebook on the table with a groan. "Damn dreams woke me up again." He picked up the steaming mug, taking a sip. It was the perfect sweetness, after weeks of this routine. "What about you, Tokoyami?" Tokoyami looked back at Izuku from the couch, nodding. "The darkness called to me from my abode," he said in his usual melodramatic fashion. Izuku chuckled into his coffee before setting it down. "Nightmares again, huh?" Tokoyami nodded slowly, returning to his crochet project. Only Izuku and Hitoshi knew of his habit, but it was always funny when he tried to hide the project when someone walked in out of embarrassment. Izuku thought it was cool. He had tried his hand at crocheting and cross-stitching, but everything he made never stayed together. But everyone had their insecurities, and if the crocheted stuffed animals that Tokoyami gifted him on occasion meant anything, he wouldn't rat on the boy. "Training camp, this time," he muttered, his beat clacking loudly in the quiet room. Izuku hummed in acknowledgement, opening the notebook. Those ones were pretty constant for him as well, though he could bet they were different for each of them. He picked up the pencil to start work on revisions to Midnight's quirk entry when a loud crash sounded from outside. Glancing at his classmates, they all rushed forward toward the door. Izuku hesitantly looked through the window and saw nothing, just the darkness of early morning. There could be any number of things waiting for them outside, on UA's campus, one of the most secure places in Japan. But Tartarus had been the most secure, and look how that turned out. "What if it's a stray cat?" Hitoshi asked unhelpfully, glancing at the other two. Izuku's mind went to villain attack first, but a stray cat was more likely. No villain was getting onto campus this late at night, or early in the morning. It just wouldn't be smart for the League, and they were clever. Izuku cracked open the door, hesitantly stepping out. The other two followed behind him as if he were a shield. Rude. A trash can from beside the dorms clattered again, drawing their attention. He tensed up as the cold from outside and the uncertainty of what the hell was watching them ran through his body. Izuku silently crept towards the upturned trash can, gasping as a small figure raced past him. Hitoshi and Tokoyami both held a hand to his back as they watched the child run away. Izuku quickly reached towards the child's form, touching their shoulder gently before they turned around, fear filling their eyes. Suddenly, he was in a darkened mall, the sound of the water fountain the first thing that assaulted his senses. The second was the smell of bleach that hung in the damp and dark air. Hitoshi and Tokoyami stood beside him, clearly confused as to what had just happened. "A teleportation quirk?" Tokoyami asked, rubbing at his head. "Great, so they all had a blinding headache. It wasn't just Izuku." Izuku shook his head at Tokoyami's question, slowly taking in his surroundings. "If you look at the things further away or more detailed, they're all foggy, and I have an itchy sensation over my skin." Izuku rubbed at his arms, trying to clear the cold pins and needles that covered it. "Teleportation would be a strange quirk type for what we're seeing," he quickly analyzed, scanning the area over and over again. Hitoshi nodded, rubbing at his neck. "I feel like rocks or something are stabbing my face." Izuku hummed, ideas racing through his mind. If they were really in the mall, that would mean that their minds and bodies were under stress right now, to account for the blurry details and sensations in their skins. He had another idea, but he wasn't set on it. There were too many quirks in the world to place what the hell had just happened to them this early. They either needed to figure out how to get back to UA, or they needed to wait and see. He was fine waiting. until Shigaraki stepped out from the shadows, deformed and covered in slow dripping blood that splashed against the mall tiles loudly, pooling at his feet that dragged across the floor, spreading blood and pools of decay as he walked, his skin flaking off. Shigaraki had only looked like that in his nightmares. Izuku sighed, dragging a hand down his face. Fuck him, huh? Hitoshi shifted his stance, hands curling into fists as he stared at the slow-moving Shigaraki. What are you thinking, Izuku? Some information would be helpful. Izuku nodded, watching as the rest of his classmates slowly materialized around him. Their faces and bodies were obscured. It's a dream quirk. We're in subconscious dreams. I'm assuming our bodies fall on the floor, I'm probably in the grass, and you must have hit the gravel. The assumption was a quick one, but he couldn't piece together more than that right now. I'm going to guess mine, as that version looks familiar to me. He gestured to the Shigaraki as his classmates looked between each other. All of his classmates' forms shifted and were growing harder to make out. Classmates such as Ida and Ojiro had parts of their bodies cleared of the haze, specifically their quirk mutation parts. He gazed over at Hitoshi and Tokoyami, seeing the same things from them. Tokoyami's entire body was blurred, but Dark Shadow, who stuck her head out from around him, was clear. Hitoshi was another matter. With no physical mutation from his quirk, his entire form shifted and made Izuku's eyes hurt. Great, so we have Nightmare Shigaraki to deal with, Hitoshi asked, looking around at Class 1A and 1B that surrounded them. As he spoke, his mouth became clear enough to see his activation requirements. Of course, his damn subconscious focused on their quirks too. We have to get your subconscious some glasses, Izuku, he joked, casting glances to Nightmare Shigaraki, who simply stood there. The darkness blurs truth, Tokoyami whispered, turning to look at Izuku. He stumbled back, eyes widening at Izuku. You are very bright, Midoriya. Hitoshi looked over at him as well, before shielding his eyes. You really see yourself as a shining star, huh? He chuckled, standing up fully, averting his eyes from Izuku. Izuku looked down at his hands, frowning. I don't see anything, he muttered, flipping his scarred hands around. Hitoshi chuckled, watching the form of Shigaraki. It was disturbing, if he was being honest. The way that Midoriya's subconscious turned Shigaraki into a literal monster was terrifying. As for Midoriya himself, his body glowed with lines of bright lightning, shining green and white. He didn't have Midoriya's mind to work out why that was, but he didn't care enough. We need to find a way to break out of this quirk. He could make stupid jokes all night, but he really did not want to see what his nightmare-riddled friend truly dreamed of. His mumblings about them were spooky enough, thank you. Midoriya and Tokoyami nodded their agreement, looking for an exit. Midoriya turned around himself, putting his back to the still monster Shigaraki. That was a mistake. Shigaraki broke out in an inhuman fast run, wrapping his hand around Midoriya's throat tightly. Hitoshi tried to reach towards him, but a force held him back, like a barrier between him and Midoriya. Midoriya gasped, his neck pulled back by the bleeding and skinless hand. He reached up at his neck, trying to scratch away the hands. Right. This was his nightmare. Shigaraki didn't seem to care about Hitoshi or Tokoyami, but he would not leave his friend to deal with this alone. Hitoshi took that as an opportunity, redirecting his attention from Midoriya and instead punching the monster across the jaw. He half expected his fist to fly through, but it connected, breaking the monster's jaw with a loud crack and sending him across the room. Hitoshi shook his hand, trying to get feeling back into it. God, his bones were tough. We can fight, Tokoyami said very helpfully. He sent Dark Shadow after the monster Shigaraki, who tried to stand up, encasing him in a wave of darkness. That was the end of that. Hitoshi watched in horror as Dark Shadow disintegrated in front of them, the crack slowly leading towards Tokoyami's body. That shouldn't... He started before choking, blood seeping from his mouth as cracks started forming along his body. Hitoshi really needed to stop thinking things were all fine and dandy. Midoriya reached out for him, stumbling through tears. The lightning over him seemed to dim as Tokoyami crumbled out of existence. Midoriya crawled towards the dust, trying to gather it, pull it towards himself. His body shook with sobs, though no sound came out. Hitoshi reached down to comfort him. Tokoyami wasn't dead. It was just a bad dream. But his hands passed straight through Izuku as his lightning shifted again. He turned to look at his Toshi, eyes no longer bright green. Instead, they were a duller green, not anything like the eyes he had seen before, the eyes he had come to care for. "You shouldn't be here," Midoriya said, but the voice wasn't his. It was gargled and clear at the same time, an older man speaking to him, looking directly at him. Something wasn't right. This wasn't his friend. He watched in horror as his classmate suddenly cracked and disintegrated as Shigaraki grabbed the back of his neck. Pain shot through his body as he screamed, watching his body slowly flake away as if from a third-person viewpoint. Not Midoriya simply stared at him. "You with me, Hitoshi?" Tokoyami asked, patting his cheek roughly. Hitoshi pushed his hand away, grabbing the back of his neck. He was whole again. But they weren't awake back outside of the dorm. Instead, they were in a ruined countryside. Destroyed houses and fallen trees blocked their vision all around. Tokoyami was still blurred just as before, and it made Hitoshi's head pound. They must have still been in Midoriya's dreams. Part of him was glad it wasn't his. Hitoshi groaned, pushing himself to his feet. "We're still in the nightmare," he said, rubbing at his eyes. This was officially the worst night of sleep he had gotten. Tokoyami nodded, stepping around the area and kicking at the rocks on the ground. "I've been in this abode for minutes." "Then you appeared from the abyss," Tokoyami explained, picking up a decently big rock and chucking it into the distance. As it flew, it fizzled out of existence into nothing. So they were not following that rock. Hitoshi did not want to die again. That experience had been a one-and-done thing, thank you. Suddenly, a skinny teenager appeared before them, looking over them. There was something familiar about his blonde hair and blue eyes. The lightning that had covered Izuku now covered him, though it was duller and gold instead of green. Hitoshi gasped, taking a step back. "All Might." He didn't know how he even placed the man, as he looked so different from even the small form that he now used. He looked healthier and taller, more human. The skinny teenager, All Might, nodded slowly. His mouth was covered with a gold smoke, rendering him unable to speak. He glanced around the area, pushing his hair tufts back. Hitoshi couldn't help but stare at the strange form of the retired symbol of peace in awe. Tokoyami stepped forward, poking All Might's shoulder. All Might batted his hand away, looking at him quizzingly. "You're just so different," Tokoyami commented, shrugging. All Might looked offended as an explosion sounded in the distance. He turned to the sound, adjusting his stance. Out of the woods came a large form of an attractive man in a suit. His red eyes and white hair contrasted sharply with the greens of the forest. All Might suddenly had tears streaming down his face as he watched the man hold a hand up the mangled and limp body of a woman. There was a faint orange light coming off her body as well, illuminating her bloodied face. Hitoshi recognized her instantly. "Cloudwalker," he whispered, his mind racing. Izuku might know most heroes, but he knew the underground ones. Cloudwalker had died before he was born, but she was a large name in the underground. She had taken down many villain organizations before being slain in a battle. "Why would Midoriya have this nightmare?" Tokoyami asked as the villain grabbed Cloudwalker's head with his other hand and squeezed. Blood splattered onto the three of them as her head exploded like a grape. The lightning disappeared from her body, and All Might's glowed brighter. All Might's tears turned to blood as he tried to reach for the body of the old pro-hero. A small yellow blur shot out of the forest, grabbing All Might roughly and jumping away from them, shots of air leaving his feet. As Hitoshi watched All Might get taken up into the sky, the world slowly turned red. He could have sworn that All Might's eyes had changed colors. They were Midoriya green. Hitoshi felt the ominous presence behind him, making chills run down his back. Before he could turn around, a burning pain coursed through his body, making him cough up blood. Tokoyami coughed as well, the blood pouring from his beak. The world shifted and melted, turning into a blast of colors and shapes before it all disappeared, black again. Shota groaned, grabbing his winter coat. He should have been working on lesson plans, but instead he was struggling to find his slippers. A loud knock on the door had alerted him to an issue, but it couldn't have been that important. Nezu would have sounded the alarms. He pushed open his bedroom door, being careful not to wake up his Ashi. He was a deep sleeper, unlike Shota. Charging to the front door of the teacher's dorms, he opened it slowly. A form raced away from the door, black clothes blending into the night. Shota was going to kill his students for this prank. He frowned, watching the shape get smaller. None of his students ran like that. It was a sloppy form, one that would never work as a pro-hero. Vlad would never teach his students to run like that. Something was very wrong. Grabbing a flashlight from the charging station, he threw off his stupid slippers and raced out of the dorm. This wasn't a student. His students may be stupid, but they would never wake him early. The form ran to Class 1A's dorms before disappearing around the back. Shota turned to follow before hearing a sound. People breathing heavily. All his students should be asleep. In their dorms, out of the cold. But the sounds were constant. Shaky, but constant. Ignoring the form for now, he moved to investigate the sound. Shinso, Midoriya, and Tokoyami all lay in odd positions in front of the dorm doors. Bending down, he could feel their breaths fogging up the cold night air. He knew they all struggled to sleep, but to be asleep in this weather here was not normal. "Wake up, kids," he said, trying to shake them awake. They didn't move at all. Their skin and feathers were coated in a thin layer of sweat as their breathing grew heavier. "Shit, kids," he muttered, standing up and tying his hair up out of his face. Pulling out his phone, he quickly hit the contact labeled "Rat Bastard." It rang only once before Nezu answered, his voice perky and cheery. "What may I assist you with this early in the morning?" he asked as if he had no clue. Shota wasn't an idiot. He could see the blinking red light of the camera above the door, trained on them. "Get me some help out here now, you bastard. You should have already done that instead of watching them." Nezu giggled over the phone, the sound haunting Shota. "It is simply marvelously entertaining, my dear pupil. I will have other staff out to assist you soon. I assure you they are under no physical danger." The phone clicked off in his hand, making him groan. Of course. The fucking rat knew more than he told. He always did. Just for the sake of his entertainment. He may be the smartest creature in Japan, but he did not know how life worked. He looked over the trio of kids, frowning. Midoriya looked in the worst shape. His hand twitched and his face contorted as a wide range of emotions crossed over it. His breathing was ragged and interrupted by the soft mutterings he had. The same muttering he had when something was very, very wrong. Shota knew the kid, and he knew the differences between when his brain went too fast for others. Shota cared for all his students, but knowing Midoriya, he had attracted the trouble. He was a villain magnet, for crying out loud. Gently picking up the kid, he used his hip to push open the door. He carried him to the couch, setting him down. As if things couldn't get more chaotic, Todoroki walked out, rubbing at his eyes. Catching sight of Midoriya, he hurried over, staring at Shota. "What happened?" Shota shrugged, slowly taking off the boy's shirt. The sweat that coated him was concerning, and Shota wanted to get his internal temperature down. "Get me 3 ice packs, Todoroki, and ice water." Todoroki nodded before leaving the room to grab what was asked. Shota headed back to the door, flicking on the fan in the community room. He took Shinso next, as his face was smack down on a bed of rocks. Carrying him in and setting him in the armchair, Todoroki looked just as confused as Shota felt, placing an ice pack on both of the boys' necks. "Tokoyami is the last one," Shota said, heading back into the cold. He brought Tokoyami in, setting him on the other armchair. Taking off his ridiculous cloak, Shota took the ice pack from the boy, placing it on his emo student. "Check that everyone else is still here. I want everyone up and down here to make sure they can wake up." Todoroki looked over the odd collection of his classmates before nodding and heading upstairs. This was going to be a long day. Hitoshi dodged as a fist came flying at his head. He and Tokoyami had been in a tiring battle for the past few minutes, simply trying to avoid getting hit. They had no time to counteract as more fists came flying at them. All around them, a battle ensued. People in flamboyant hero costumes were being destroyed by a singular man in a white suit. The same one from the last nightmare. He simply touched a person and their bodies were ruined. Some crumpled to the floor, some combusted, others yet fell apart like puzzle pieces. Blood covered the floor, making Hitoshi slip as he dodged another punch from a hero. The damn heroes were fighting each other as if they were the villains here. Cloudwalker's form caught his attention as he stumbled to the floor. "Tokoyami, this way," he shouted, trying to avoid getting hit as they made their way through the carnage, back the way the man in a suit had come. He paid them no mind as he continued killing heroes. They weren't truly here. "What ails you?" Tokoyami asked Cloudwalker when they reached her. She didn't respond as she sobbed, clinging to a man with black hair. His bottom half was gone, ripped apart from his torso. Hitoshi didn't recognize him, and judging by the confused look on Tokoyami's face, neither did he. But the lightning that covered his body, a teal and white mix, was the connector to everything else they had seen. He just noticed Cloudwalker's lightning was no longer surrounding her. The man pulled a hair from his head, handing it to Cloudwalker. She took it carefully and placed it in her mouth. Hitoshi couldn't help but cringe as she swallowed the blood-covered hair. Her body suddenly grew bright, orange and white lightning coating her body like a blanket. The man she held went limp against her, blood-stained costume, his color fading away like hers had done a dream prior. She screamed as her lightning absorbed her body, tearing at flesh and cracking her bones. Hitoshi tried to look away, but felt compelled to watch as her body continued to grow brighter, the air being too hot to breathe. She turned to Hitoshi and Tokoyami, her mouth ripping apart, tears streaming down her face. Izuku's green eyes stared back. "Get out now," her voice muttered before she fully disappeared in a flash of blinding white light. Hitoshi could feel a sudden pain that was gone soon after, being replaced by a cold, tidal feeling. Fumikage gripped his head, holding it tightly. The blinding light had only aggravated his pounding headache, making an abysmal thing worse. "Where do we reside currently?" he asked, searching around. Shinso stood beside him, but was silent as they surveyed the wreckage of a time long past. Another ruined city sat in front of them, though this one seemed older in style. Streetlights weren't as bright as they were in Japan now. Signs were blue instead of the now standard green. The difference was that there was no screaming, no cries of heroes being destroyed. It was also blurrier. Each time they switched, it grew gradually more hard to make anything out. It truly was a dizzying thing they were experiencing. Fumikage watched as the man in the suit walked away from a ruined building, popping his knuckles. He had been the same in every nightmare, a constant in the changing narratives. He was Izuku's monster, like Dark Shadow had once haunted Fumikage. Shinso pointed to a man who had run into the same destroyed building from the back. He was the same man they had watched die in Cloud Walker's arms. He looked younger now, only a few years older than Fumikage. They followed him, desperate to get answers, to get out of here. The young man ripped at the rubble, trying to free something underneath. Fumikage commanded Dark Shadow to help him, pulling up broken pieces of concrete and rebar. Despite his help, the man didn't acknowledge him, continuing to rip up the rubble, his fingers bloodied. "Lariat!" he screamed, grabbing at a form under the rubble. It was horrifying, the horrors that the body consisted of. Pro-Hero Lariat, an official pro-hero from when the HSPC was established, when they started to record a database of quirks and proper schools. He had practically written the book on being a true pro-hero, his name running through his history. Fumikage had just finished the most dismal history paper on the man, but the red and white lightning that encased him was a new item of interest. He coughed, blood seeping from his mouth, and, "Take this power, finish what I failed," he whispered, his words gargled as if he was drowning, and shook his head, grabbing at Lariat's face. "No, no, you can't die," he whispered, trying to keep him awake. The display tugged on Fumikage's black heart, making him choke back tears. He was not an emotional person, but everything felt so wrong and so raw to his soul, changing his image like a potter shapes clay. Lariat raised his bloodied hand to En's mouth, pressing the palm against his lips. "I give you this power out of my own free will." He kept his hand against En's face until he went limp, his eyes glazing over. Slowly, En licked at the blood on his lips, tears streaming down his face. His body grew the bright white and teal lightning marks they had seen on his older person. He turned to Fumikage and Shinso, Midoriya's eyes staring deep into theirs. "Leave before you go too deep." Building collapsed. Izashi frowned as Shinso whimpered under his touch, his face trembling as tears ran down it. Class 1A gathered around Shota, who tried to explain what had happened. Izashi had gotten a basic rundown already, and it was distressing. Chio changed the boys' ice packs and checked their temperatures again. She used a small transport kit to care for the kids. It was deemed unsafe to get the kids to the infirmary at this time, so she'd set up a makeshift one in the dorm gathering room. "It seems that they still sleep," Nezu said, clapping his hands together. Everyone jumped, turning to stare at him. No one had seen him enter as he grinned at them. "Let me dictate some rules, as your lovely principal." Izashi frowned at his tone. He seemed to be chipper for 3 of his students shivering on his couch. "How much do you know, Nezu?" Izashi asked, pulling his hand off Shinso's flushed face. Nezu's whiskers simply twitched as he ignored Izashi's question. "I want all students back in the rooms. I do not care which room you enter, but I do request you all leave the gathering room now that we see you are safe." Class 1A looked ready to argue until Shota glared at them, his hair lifting as he activated his quirk. They trudged out of the room in groups, whispers filling the hallway as they left in a state of shock. Only Todoroki hung back, hesitating as he watched Midoriya on the couch. Shota gently nudged him out of the room, watching to see him head to the elevator. "What do you want me to do, Rat?" Shota asked, turning around and tucking his hands in his pocket. Hizashi couldn't help but admire how straightforward his boyfriend was, never having time for formalities. I would like you, Hizashi, and all my other available staff scouring the campus. He pulled a controller from his pocket, pressing a button in the center. Hizashi could feel the ground rumble as security measures were lowered. No one was getting in or out without Nezu's permission. I believe our quirk user is still around the area. Hitoshi stared at the forest they now found themselves in. It wasn't ruined like the other one. Instead, it stood beautifully intact, the only sign of human life being the footpath that they stood on. The blurriness of the world hurt his head, but he ignored the searing pain, instead searching for Tokoyami. Shinso, has the feeling of the pebble stopped? Tokoyami asked suddenly, rubbing at his arms. Hitoshi frowned, realizing he was correct. If Izuku was also correct, it meant that something had happened to their bodies. He hoped that they weren't just taken by the League. We need to find a way out of this nightmare. Maybe we can exhaust them. It was the only idea he had. Izuku had to run out of your dream soon, right? Tokoyami started down the trail, ignoring his idea as Hitoshi followed close behind. The woods seemed to grow denser, hiding more than a foot in front of them, coupled with the growing haze. He grabbed Tokoyami's cape, making sure to keep them together. Suddenly the trees vanished, showing a small cabin in the woods. The pro-hero Lariat walked up to the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the clearing. He looked like all the photos Hitoshi had ever seen, with no lightning covering him. And judging by the trajectory of these dreams, they'd see it at the end, before they died. Again. Hitoshi and Tokoyami walked up to it as the door slowly creaked open. Hello? Lariat's voice called, no longer gargled like it had been in the last dream. You called for me? A figure emerged from the dark house. An old man with drooping skin and a cane slowly made his way forward. Thin, shaky lines of white and lavender lightning coated his veins. He coughed, a sickly sound, wiping at his mouth. Pro-hero Lariat, thank you for coming quickly. Lariat nodded slowly, carefully watching the old man. Why did you need me? The old man laughed, rubbing at his eyes. I simply wanted a drink with my favorite hero, before I died of old age. Lariat nodded, rubbing at his neck awkwardly. He took the glass the old man offered, cheering it into the air but not drinking it. The old man frowned, gesturing for him to take a sip. Lariat lifted the cup to his lips and drank only a drop. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, sending the water contents all over it. The old man laughed, rubbing at his eyes. Use the power well, Lariat. Defeat our enemy like I know you will. Lariat's body exploded with red lightning, his hands shaking as he gripped at his throat, falling to the floor. The old man stumbled, hitting the floor hard, the lightning dispersing. His head started bleeding as he lay motionless. Lariat grabbed at the notebook that tumbled from his form, throwing it open. Inside was simply a mirror that reflected Hitoshi and Tokoyami over his shoulder. You've seen too much, kids. Lariat spoke, his eyes turning to Izuku's. Black whips shot out of them, choking them. Their windpipes were slowly crushed under Izuku's gaze. The next one was different. It was so blurry and foggy that Hitoshi couldn't see anything, not even Tokoyami. Are you there, Tokoyami? He called, trying to look around. A hand grabbed his tightly as they listened to the sound of fighting and machine guns in the background. Hitoshi pulled himself and Tokoyami to the floor, praying that they wouldn't get in the way. These nightmares had to mean something, had to be a pattern, a story. I can't be saved, a small voice spoke in front of them. Take the power and go. Make it stronger. The old man's voice from before spoke. It sounded younger and fresher, but Hitoshi could tell it was his. He didn't know how, but he could. I will. Thank you. Lavender and white lightning cut through the fog, allowing him to see the now young old man and an adult with a black bandana around his forehead. The old man turned to them, his green eyes dancing with lightning. It's too late. Tokoyami screeched as bullets entered their chests, ripping through their hearts. This one was worse. They had been getting shorter and shorter, as well as harder to figure out. Hitoshi felt like he was drowning in pain and fear as the pounding in his head grew. He could hear people talking but couldn't understand what they said. He could hear screams that they sounded 100 miles away. He couldn't see or feel Tokoyami anymore, no matter how hard he searched. A searing pain tore through him, like nothing he had ever felt before. No matter how many times he died in this nightmare-like escape, nothing could compare to the raw fire that coursed under his skin, tearing at his very inside, searching for something. It found it slowly tearing itself from his being, ripping through his head. He passed out as the duller green eyes from the first nightmare stared back. Shota shot out his capture weapon, grabbing the dark figure by his heel. They fell hard to the floor, barely catching themselves with their hands. Shota stalked towards them, a rage seething through his body. This person dared to come into his school, hurt his kids, wake him up early. That last one probably shouldn't have been a big deal, but it upset Shota nonetheless. "What the hell did you do to my problem children?" he asked, reaching down to grab the small form. The person screamed, pulling back from his hand. Shota pulled his hand back, crouching down to their height. The eyes of a child stared back. That was why he was so small. He was just a child, Aries' age. "Don't touch me. I'll hurt you," he said through tears. His deep black eyes reflected Shota's hard expression. Shota sighed, rubbing at his eyes. "I'm sorry, kid. I'm a little wound up." He stood up, untying the scarf from the kid's ankle gently. "We need your help, though. I don't think you truly want to hurt me." The kid stared up at him fearfully, shaking his head. "That's all I do. You can't touch me. I hurt those kids too." Shota shook his head, offering the bottom of his scarf to the kid. "Come with me. We can help you figure out how to get my students awake. You can help." The kid hesitantly took the end of the scarf, following after Shota. He wanted to go faster. He wanted to save his kids right now. But he also needed this kid to be at ease. He needed to figure out how to break his quirk. He slowly cracked open the door to the 1A dorms, letting the kid peek in before he opened it fully. Chiyo and Nezu were the only two staff members inside, the others still searching for the kid. "I see we found our culprit," Nezu said, grinning. Hitoshi watched a sickly-looking young man cough from where he sat on a large chair. Tokoyami was beside him again as they watched. A smoke like the one that covered All Might's mouth now choked Hitoshi and Tokoyami. It was clear in the room, no haze on Tokoyami and no haze in the air. They could feel the cold chill of the room and hear the sickening breath of the white-haired man. "Are you the one in the suit?" Hitoshi signed, hoping the white-haired man would understand it. He seemed shocked before shaking his head. "That is my brother, unfortunately," he responded, his voice coarse like Shigaraki's. In truth, he looked similar to the villain, though his skin was intact. He chuckled, tapping his finger on his chair. "I am like that boy in many ways. He shares some of my blood, as well as my name, but he is not me." Hitoshi frowned. "You can hear our thoughts." "I can, though yours are the only ones I understand. His are unknown terms." Shigaraki gestured to Tokoyami, who looked down, embarrassed. Dark Shadow appeared, flying towards Shigaraki. She approached slowly, allowing the man time to refuse. Shigaraki nodded, allowing Dark Shadow to nestle under his arm. He stood up, utilizing her as a crutch. Walking toward the pair of students, he stared into each one's eyes in turn. "You have dived too far, Nine's friends," he spoke slowly, making sure they understood. "You will not be able to forget this. It will change you." "Where is Midoriya?" Hitoshi signed carefully, making sure he could see. Shigaraki frowned, gesturing a hand behind him. The 7 other people they had seen appeared in chairs around them, staring with their own eyes. Rainbow lightning seemed to course through the very room, humming under their feet. "Nine is unable to join us. He is trapped in his own nightmare, and we are unable to help." Hitoshi nodded, looking into the saddened eyes of each person. Shigaraki chuckled, turning to Tokoyami. "I am sorry we cannot explain better." He nodded at Tokoyami, who nodded back. "But you are running out of time in our world. We are all working to keep the connection to your brains so it is not fried when your teacher takes you out." Hitoshi tried to piece together what he could, but it was all so much. Izuku had 8 others living in his mind. Could he talk to them when he wanted? And Lariat's quirk was the same as Izuku's black whip. That couldn't have been a coincidence. All Might look different in this view as well. He sat unmoving in his seat, his entire body made of gold smoke. All the others looked how they had seen them, except healthy. They weren't dying at the man in the suit's hand. "That man is who you know as the Scourge of Kamino, the one who revealed 8's weakened form." Cloudwalker spoke softly, getting their attention. "He has been after us for a long time now, and now Izuku is the next to fight him." "He is the last," Lariat added, nodding at the boys. 7 and 8's choices were not fit for this responsibility, but some of us had very little say in who inherited our power. Hitoshi shivered as he felt the world shift and turn, the vibrations of the lightning sounding off. "We are out of time. We cannot stay here any longer for fear of destroying your minds," Shigaraki said through coarse breath. He leaned against Dark Shadow more, struggling to stay standing. Found number 9. All the voices spoke at once, ringing through Hitoshi's mind. The world tilted on its side, sending Tokoyami and Hitoshi plummeting into the depths. Boys, boys, Shota called, watching as Shinso and Tokoyami slowly woke up. They opened their eyes, groaning and grabbing at their heads. Who knows what the quirk had done to them? Seemingly gave them an awful migraine as they winced at the loud noise and shut their eyes against the lights. It had taken some time to get the boy to calm down enough to break the connection. Shota had to use erasure in conjunction with the boy's attempts to break the link until it had finally worked. Is Midoriya awake? Tokoyami asked, blinking slowly. Shota looked over at Midoriya, frowning. He had not woken up. His shivering had also increased as well as his body temperature. That banquet of darkness has him in its right clutches. Shota was too tired to piece together what exactly he meant. Are you two all right? He asked, kneeling in front of his kids. They looked awful, but they were awake. They could figure out everything from there. Shinso shook his head, rubbing his eyes again. We need to go back in. We need to save Midoriya, he mumbled, looking at the kid beside Shota. Send us back in. The kid flinched as Shota shook his head. No one is doing anything. I don't know what happened to you, but I am not having it happen again. Shinso frowned at him, a deep scowl on his face. We will find a way to wake up Midoriya without putting you down again. Tokoyami shook his head, his feathers bristling slightly. You do not understand our cause. We fight to keep the villains of darkness at bay. Midoriya will become one with the night if you do not allow us to accompany him in the dark. Shinso nodded along with Tokoyami's words as if he could understand the student, staring at Shota. Please, Sensei. It is the only way, he whispered, grabbing Shota's hand. Without asking for approval from the rat bastard, Shota beckoned the young boy over. Are you okay to put them back to sleep? He asked softly. The boy looked surprised, staring at both Tokoyami and Shinso before nodding. Shota had learned to trust his students after the USJ, no matter how bad he felt about everything right now. The kid reached forward to touch Shinso, who suddenly veered back. Hold on. The boy's hand shot back to his side, his shoulders shaking. Do you know how your quirk works? He asked the boy, who shook his head. We must create identical results to the one that took us last misery, Tokoyami suggested, tapping his hands together. Dark Shadow nodded behind him. Shinso looked at Shota, fear in his eyes. You three need to leave the room. I think it's a distance activation. I can't analyze it like Izuku, but we need to be careful. He shivered as he rubbed at his arms. I don't want you to go through that. Shota frowned before nodding. You can do this, kid. Just come get us when they're asleep, okay? I hate to ask so much of you, but you are brave. The kid nodded, wringing his hands together. Shota wanted to rip his kids away from this entire mess and go into whatever had scarred them this much, but he trusted them. He had to trust them. He gently tried to nudge Chiyo and Nezu out, getting an old lady slap on the hand. This is a bad idea, Nezu, Chiyo said, though she slowly made her way out of the room. We shall see, Nezu replied, his whiskers upturned in a grin, and Shota shut the door to the gathering room behind him. I need you to touch him, kid, not me. The kid stared up at Hitoshi, scared, before nodding. His fingers hovered over Midoriya's shaking form before touching his bare skin. Hitoshi gasped, rubbing at his arms. He and Tokoyami were back in the dream world, but it was different. No longer did 8 people stare back at them. Instead, they were in a pitch-black room, white writing covering his walls. It was so layered with writing that Hitoshi couldn't make anything out, save for a few familiar names. It looked like Midoriya's messy notebooks. The sound of scribbling took Hitoshi's thoughts away. Slowly following the sound and writing on the wall, he saw Midoriya hunched over, his messy green hair bright against the monochrome of the room. Dark Shadow shot out from Tokoyami, excited to see Izuku again. They approached slowly before Dark Shadow bolted back, hiding under Tokoyami's cloak. That's not Midori, her high-pitched voice said shakily. Hitoshi took a step back as Midoriya looked at them, his eyes flashing between green and red. His mouth moved quickly as he mumbled, his hands shaking. Dropping the marker, he stood up, facing them fully. He was taller than Midoriya was, and his once curly hair was now pinned straight, tied behind him in a small bun. His freckles remained the same, but new scars and marks covered every inch of his body. But what was the most concerning was the outfit he wore. It wasn't one of Midoriya's joke shirts. It was a suit. The same suit that the old Shigaraki's brother wore, that the Scourge of Kamino wore. Who are you? Tokoyami asked slowly, trying to hide the way his feathers and hands shook in worry. The fusion tilted his head slightly, like Midoriya did when he was confused. It was strange to see this mannerism on this not quite Midoriya. I am Izuku. He allowed me to join into his mind. Hitoshi shook his head, swallowing his fear. He would never allow someone like you in here. You need to leave, now. The fusion laughed, a deep, grating sound to Hitoshi and Tokoyami. This wasn't Midoriya. This power is mine, and I will get it back despite my successor's attempts. The fusion shifted features, pulling in half. It separated down the center, two forms emerging. The smaller one, a young kid version of Midoriya, was grabbed by the larger one, the man in the suit. He didn't look like the scourge of Kamino. He looked like a normal businessman. You are simply kids meddling in my affairs. He tightened his hold on Child Midoriya's neck, making him squirm uncomfortably, and I will enjoy killing each and every one of you like I did all those who came before. Not me, the old young man said, stepping out from behind Hitoshi and Tokoyami. I died from old age. The Scourge's face turned into a scowl, spitting at the floor. You are a coward who would refuse to fight me. You were pretty cowardly with that spit in my water trick, Lariat agreed, placing a hand on his shoulder, and chuckled, stepping out to join his predecessor. That's disgusting, For. There had to be a better way to give your quirk to him. For simply shrugged. You can't say anything, Six, Cloudwalker joked, stepping out from the shadows as well. You drank Five's blood. All Might followed after her, shrugging. He still had that gold smoke over his mouth, preventing him from speaking. Shut up, the Scourge said, digging his nails into Child Midoriya's neck. He shook, trying to rip at the large man's hands. I will kill you all again if I have to. All Might pointed to himself as if asking a question. The Scourge's face turned a bright red in anger as the other three stepped to the front. Hitoshi had never seen 2 and 3's faces, but they looked exhausted, helping prop up the sickly man. It's over, brother, Shigaragi spoke, coughing. We will not allow you to leave this prison of your own design. I gave you this quirk, he screamed, throwing his hands around, seemingly ignoring the kid who struggled to rip his neck away. It is my quirk, and I will not stop until I get it back. Hitoshi stepped up now. This might not be his battle, but he needed to save Midoriya. It is Midoriya's quirk. I may not know what the hell is happening, but you will not take anything from Midoriya while his friends are standing. Do you understand? The Scourge started before Hitoshi grabbed hold with his quirk. His headache doubled tenfold as voices filled his head. So many screams, so many people were fighting for his attention. He collapsed to his knees as he fought against everyone, trying to hold the rope tight, resecuring every line that snapped. Tokoyami raced forward, shouting orders at Dark Shadow, who complied, though shaking. You will not win this battle of darkness. The oppressed will power through your banquet of misery, he said, using Dark Shadow's tight grip to wrestle young Midoriya free of the man's hand. Hitoshi dropped the hold, gripping his head in pain. Tokoyami could do it alone from here. Plus, he had Dark Shadow. What did you just say to me? Scourge asked, looking at Tokoyami in puzzlement. He was so confused he hadn't even thought to grab Midoriya back. Tokoyami ignored the question, wrapping Midoriya up in his quirk for protection, racing back behind the adults. We have you now, young one, he whispered into Midoriya's curly hair. Hitoshi crawled over to them, shielding the standoff of the adults behind them. That wasn't his issue. His issue was his young friend, who looked horrified. We need you to wake up with us, Midoriya, Hitoshi said slowly, taking the frightened boy's hand in his own. Midoriya stared up at him, tears steaming his eyes. This is a bad dream, he asked, his voice wavering. Hitoshi nodded, tight-lipped, running a hand over the boy's hand. It is all a bad dream, Midoriya. We just have to wake up. Midoriya nodded, pushing himself into Tokoyami, gripping Hitoshi's hand hard. Then I say we wake up. Shota jumped up as Midoriya shot up, panting heavily. He shook with chills as Shota rubbed his back softly. You're awake now, Izuku. We're going to help you. The young boy shivered beside Shota, staring at Midoriya. I'm very sorry for making you sleep, sir. I didn't mean to. Midoriya grimaced, rubbing at his hands. Putting a smile on, he spoke softly to the kid. It's not your fault, kid. I'm okay. Shota could hear the way he tried to reassure himself as his voice shook. The boy shook slightly under Midoriya's gaze, nodding before running from the room to go see Nezu outside. He would come under UA's protection before they found his parents, if the kid had any. Your brain activities have returned to normal, and your temperatures are at a safe level. My corp will not be able to assist you, but some rest will do you well. Recovery Girl nodded at the 3 teens, who shivered in their exposed torsos, looking at each other quietly. Shota nodded in place of them. I will make sure they get proper rest. They have all day off today to rest. The cover girl nodded, satisfied, slowly removing her equipment from the room and shutting the door behind her. Shota turned back to the boys, running a hand through his hair. It is up to you three if you would like to talk to a therapist about what you saw. Tokoyami and Shinso stared at Midoriya worriedly. The day is yours. Your classmates are already in class, though they are worried. Get some rest. I'll check in on you later. He left the room, shutting and locking the dorm room door behind him. Izuku frowned as Aizawa walked away from them, shutting the door. He startled as Tokoyami and Shinso crawled up beside him, adding pressure to his chest. It will be okay, Midoriya, Hitoshi says, his soothing voice a nice comfort to Izuku. He's deep and raspy, but calming like a warm blanket. Dark shadows settled on Izuku's lap, allowing him to pet it like a cat. The darkness will pass, Midoriya. We will stand with you to face the battle, Tokoyami whispered, rubbing at Izuku's back. I'm sorry, he managed to mumble through the tears that had started to pool from his eyes. He could feel the vestiges in him still fighting all for one as he leaned into his friends, letting their warmth wash over him as his entire body screamed. Izuku hated his dreams.